I knew something was wrong the second I stepped into the lobby of Halcyon Capital. The receptionist, Lila, usually greeted me with a bright smile and a rehearsed, "Good morning." Ember. Today, she didn't even look up. Her eyes were locked onto her screen like it held the answer to a question she didn't want to hear. I paused for half a second longer than usual. Just enough to confirm it wasn't in my head. It wasn't. I hadn't even set my bag down when my phone buzzed. Subject: Urgent Performance Review. 9:15 a.m. Location Conference Room. B7. No body, no signature, all caps. Cute. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting that familiar, cold awareness settle in. 12 consecutive quarters of growth, one of the largest accounts in the firm secured just weeks ago, worth over $25 million in projected revenue. I had built that deal from nothing, a sketch on a napkin at 30,000 feet. And now, this last-minute performance review with no context. I didn't panic. I never do. But something deep in my spine tightened the kind of instinct you don't ignore after years in this game. People like to call it intuition. I call it pattern recognition. And every pattern I knew was pointing to one thing. Something big was about to happen. And whatever it wasn't going to be in my favor. Before I take you deeper into how everything unraveled, take a second to subscribe to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. And what time is it there right now? This is a fictional story, shaped with a touch of AI to make the details more vivid and immersive. But the emotions, the tension, the lessons, those are very real. And I have a feeling you're going to feel every bit of it. I didn't head straight to conference room B7. Not yet. Instead, I took the long way around past the open workstations, the glass-walled offices, the little corners where conversations usually flowed freely. Today, everything felt muted. Conversations cut off the second I walked by. A few heads turned, then quickly turned away. One of the analysts I'd personally mentored for years suddenly found something very urgent to do with the printer. That was the moment it clicked. They knew. Or at least, they suspected. I kept walking, calm on the outside. But my mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. When you've been in high-stakes finance long enough, you learn to read silence better than words. And this silence, it wasn't accidental. It was coordinated, contained. Something had already been decided. I slipped into my office and quietly closed the door behind me. No hesitation now. My hand moved straight to the bottom drawer. The one I kept locked. The one no one ever asked about. Inside was a thin, black folder, my original employment contract, along with every amendment I had personally negotiated. I placed it on the desk, flipped it open, and went straight to the section I remembered rewriting months ago. Clause 11C. My eyes scanned the lines once, then again. Slower. There it was, still intact, still initialed, still legally binding. A small, almost imperceptible smile crossed my face. Because if what I was sensing was true, if they were about to do what I thought they were about to do, then this wasn't going to end the way they expected. Not even close. Conference room B7 was already sealed when I arrived. The blinds were drawn, the lights slightly dimmer than usual, like someone had tried to soften the blow before it even landed. Inside, 3 people were waiting. Marissa from HR sat stiffly at the far end of the table, her hands folded too neatly to be natural. Next to her was Daniel Reeves, the interim COO, avoiding eye contact like it might implicate him, and beside them, another HR rep I barely recognized, clutching a folder like it contained something fragile. No laptops, no reports, no discussion materials, just a single sheet of paper placed carefully in front of Marissa. I didn't sit. "Ember," Marissa began. Her voice dipped in that rehearsed sympathy tone I'd heard her use before. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Of course," I replied evenly. "I always make time when it matters." No one smiled. She glanced down at the paper, then back at me. as if hoping I might somehow make this easier for her. I didn't. I'll be direct, she continued. Due to ongoing restructuring within Halcyon Capital, your position has been eliminated, effective immediately. There it was. No build-up, no explanation, just the corporate guillotine. Clean and efficient. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, but still said nothing. I let a small breath out, slow and controlled, as if I were processing something routine. No shock, no anger, no questions. Understood, I said. That was it. Marissa blinked, clearly thrown off. She had expected resistance, maybe even a scene. People usually bargain at this stage. Or break. I did neither. This decision has been finalized by executive leadership, she added quickly, as if reinforcing it would make it more real. I assumed as much. A pause settled over the room. Heavier now, uncertain. I'll need your access badge, she said, almost apologetically. I slipped it off without hesitation and placed it in her hand. And just like that, they thought it was over. What they didn't understand, what none of them had taken the time to understand, was that this wasn't just a termination, it was a trigger. I walked out of conference room B7 with the same calm expression, the same steady pace. But inside, everything had already shifted into place. Timing is everything in this business. And they had just made the one move they absolutely couldn't afford to make. They fired me 23 hours before my bonus was set to vest. 23. Close enough to think they were being clever, far enough, in their minds, to avoid the payout. Except they weren't avoiding anything. They were activating it. Clause 11C wasn't buried. It wasn't hidden in fine print designed to be overlooked. I had written it in clear. Deliberate language during my contract renegotiation the previous year. I had walked them through it. I had even watched them initial every single page, and now it was alive. The clause was simple in concept, devastating in execution. If I was terminated without cause within 24 hours of a scheduled equity vesting event, the company would be required to accelerate the payout, not just the bonus, everything tied to it, full equity value, additional compensation, and a multiplier designed specifically to penalize exactly this kind of maneuver. They thought firing me early would save them $4 million. In reality, it doubled the obligation and opened the door for damages. I reached my office, stepping inside for what I knew would be the last time. The space felt different now, smaller, almost, like it already knew it no longer belonged to me. I didn't rush. I didn't react. I simply placed my hand on the edge of the desk and let myself acknowledge one quiet, undeniable truth. They hadn't just let me go. They had just signed off on one of the most expensive mistakes in this company's history, and they didn't even realize it yet. I didn't go to the elevators that led to the parking garage. That would have been the expected move. The quiet exit, the defeated walk. Instead, I turned in the opposite direction and headed toward the executive lift. My reflection followed me in the mirrored doors composed. Controlled. Unreadable. I pressed the button for the legal floor. If they thought this ended in that conference room, they had already miscalculated. The doors opened to a space that always smelled faintly of toner and tension. Rows of offices, muted voices, people who understood consequences better than anyone else in the building. I walked straight past reception and stopped at a glass door halfway down the hall. Ethan Cross, senior legal counsel, sharp, observant, and one of the few people in this company who actually listened when contracts were discussed, instead of just signing them. He looked up the moment I stepped inside, confusion flashing across his face. Ember, I just heard, they terminated me, I said calmly, placing my leather folder on his desk. Effective immediately, no cause cited. That got his full attention. I opened the folder and turned it toward him. Already flipped to the page that mattered. Clause 11C, I said. Paragraph 3. He scanned it quickly at first, then again, slower. I watched the exact moment it registered the subtle shift in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. Wait, he murmured. This is still active. They initialed every page. I replied, including the amendment. He leaned back slightly, exhaling under his breath. They fired you within the trigger window, 23 hours before vesting. Silence stretched between us for a second, heavy and precise. Then he let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. They didn't just make a mistake. He said, they executed the worst possible scenario. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Everything he needed to understand was already in front of him, documented, signed, time-stamped. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, just a clean, airtight clause, waiting to be enforced. Ethan didn't ask what I wanted to do next. He didn't have to. I'll escalate this, he said, already reaching for his phone, then pausing. Quietly. At first, that would be best. I replied, for now. But I wasn't finished. I gathered the folder, gave him a brief nod, and stepped back into the hallway. Legal floors run on information, but more importantly, they run on timing. And right now, timing was everything. I walked further down the corridor until I reached a smaller cluster of workstations. That's where I found Lena Park, one of the compliance analysts I had mentored during a high-risk audit the previous year. Detail-oriented, relentless. The kind of person who didn't miss things once she knew where to look. She looked up, startled. Ember, I heard something, but you heard correctly, I said, placing the folder in front of her. I need you to review this. Her eyes dropped to the page, scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping entirely. Clause 11C, she whispered. It activates upon termination within the vesting window. I said calmly. No cause documented, no legal review present during the termination meeting. She flipped another page, then another. I watched her expression shift from confusion to focus, then to something sharper. This is airtight, she said. I know. I leaned slightly closer, lowering my voice just enough. There are 3 copies of this contract. I continued. 1 with Ethan, 1 in my personal archive, and 1 stored in a secured system that automatically releases the full documentation to the board if any changes are made to my employment record without proper clause alignment. Her head snapped up. You're serious I don't build safety nets, I said quietly. I build systems. She held the folder a little tighter now, like it carried weight beyond paper. Run it up the chain. I added, and don't let it stall. Because at this point, it wasn't just about evidence. It was about momentum. The shift started less than 30 minutes after I left the legal floor. At first, it was subtle. A few hurried footsteps in the hallway, doors closing a little too quickly, voices dropping into urgent whispers that carried just enough tension to be noticed. Then it escalated. Upstairs. In the HR suite, Marissa was no longer composed. She pushed through the glass doors with none of her earlier restraint. Laptop clutched tightly in one hand, her voice already raised before she even reached the conference table. We need documentation, now, across from her. The HR coordinator blinked. Caught off guard. Documentation of what? Of cause. Marissa snapped. Anything. Performance issues, disciplinary notes, written warnings, there has to be something. There isn't. The coordinator replied carefully, fingers already moving across the keyboard. Ember Cole has a clean record. No flags, no incidents, not even a formal complaint. That was the problem. Marissa's composure cracked further. Then find something, she insisted, her voice tightening. She walked out of that room too calm. Legal is all ready. She stopped herself, but it was too late, because by then, legal was already moving. Ethan had done exactly what I expected. Quiet escalation, targeted, precise. Within minutes, the contract had reached senior counsel, and from there, it spread exactly where it needed to go. Lena had forwarded the annotated file to compliance oversight, flagging the clause language and the timing of my termination. No speculation, just facts. Time-stamped, documented. And that's when the tone inside Halcyon Capital began to change. In a closed-door meeting 2 floors above, Senior legal counsel reviewed the file in silence, page by page, signature by signature, until finally, someone spoke. "This isn't a gray area," one of them said flatly. "This is exposure, not potential exposure, immediate, because everything aligned too cleanly. No cause for termination, no supporting documentation, no legal presence during the decision, and most critically, the timing within the protected window defined in Clause 11C. What had been intended as a cost-saving decision was now being reframed for what it actually was: a liability, and not a small one. By the time leadership realized what they had triggered, the conversation had already moved beyond HR. It was no longer about whether they had made a mistake. It was about how expensive that mistake was going to be. By the time the executive team was pulled into the emergency meeting, the tone had already shifted from confusion to controlled panic. The room on the 42nd floor felt colder than usual. No one touched the water glasses. No one checked their phones. Even the usual background hum of confidence, the quiet arrogance that came with power, was gone. At the head of the table stood Rachel Monroe, Chief Legal Officer, calm, composed, and visibly unimpressed. She placed a printed copy of the contract on the table, tapping it once with deliberate precision. "Let's be absolutely clear," she began, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is a triggered liability." Daniel leaned back in his chair, trying to maintain control. "We terminated her before the bonus vested," he said. "That was the whole point." Rachel didn't even blink. "And in doing so," she replied, "you activated Clause 11C. The room went still. Karen shifted in her seat. "That clause doesn't apply until the vesting event," she said quickly, almost defensively. Rachel slid the document across the table toward her. "Read it again." Karen didn't move. Rachel continued anyway. Clause 11C protects against termination within a 24-hour window preceding a vesting event. It exists specifically to prevent what you attempted. A pause. Then, quieter but far more dangerous. "You didn't avoid the payout. You accelerated it." Daniel's expression tightened. "So what's the actual exposure?" Rachel exhaled slowly, as if giving them one last moment before reality landed. "The original bonus was approximately $4 million, she said. "With the clause activated, we're now looking at full equity acceleration, additional compensation, and contractual multipliers." She glanced down at her notes, then back up. "Conservatively, 6 to 6.5 million, potentially more if she pursues damages." No one spoke. The number hung in the air like something physical. Karen's voice came out barely above a whisper. "That's not possible." "It is," Rachel said flatly, "and it's enforceable." Daniel looked around the room, searching for resistance, for anyone who might challenge it. There was none, because the evidence was clean. The signatures were real, the timing was undeniable, and the clause had done exactly what it was designed to do: protect her, at their expense. 4 blocks away from Halcyon Capital, I was sitting by the window of a quiet cafe, the kind of place where no one rushed and no one asked questions. The contrast was almost amusing. Inside that glass tower, they were scrambling, voices raised, emails flying, decisions unraveling faster than they could contain them. Out here, the world moved at its own pace. Cups clinked softly, conversations drifted, sunlight settled across the table like nothing had changed. I took a slow sip of my coffee and checked my phone. Right on schedule. An email had come through from Rachel Monroe. Subject Clause 11C. Acknowledged, no apology, no negotiation language, just confirmation that they had received the documentation, verified the clause, and were reviewing the full scope of liability. That was all I needed. I leaned back slightly, opening my secure archive. 3 versions of the contract sat there, untouched, each one backed by timestamps, digital signatures, and metadata trails that could withstand any level of scrutiny. Every initial, every amendment, every recorded approval. They didn't have room to argue. Across town, They were likely discussing settlement strategies, trying to calculate the least painful way out. But they were already too late for that kind of control. Because I hadn't asked for anything. No demand, no counteroffer, no threat, just the clause. That's what unsettles people the most, not aggression, but certainty. My phone buzzed again. A message this time. Lena. Compliance has escalated. Board looped in. This is moving fast. I typed a brief reply. Understood. Let me know if anything changes. Then I set the phone face down and returned to my coffee. There was nothing left for me to push. No calls to make. No pressure to apply. I had already done the work long before this moment ever arrived. Now, all I had to do was wait, because when everything is documented, aligned, and inevitable, the outcome doesn't depend on force. It depends on time. The call came the next morning. Unknown number. Corporate tone. I already knew who it was before I answered. Ember. This is Jonathan Hale from the board. Of course it was. I stepped out onto my balcony, the city stretching wide beneath me. Quiet in a way Halcyon never was. Good morning, I said calmly. He didn't waste time. We've completed our review of Clause 11C and your termination. The findings are conclusive. I let the silence sit just long enough, and I asked, a pause, then measured and controlled. The company will be honoring the full payout under the terms of your contract, accelerated equity, compensation multiplier, and associated adjustments. There it was. Not a negotiation, not a compromise, a confirmation. Within hours. The paperwork followed. Final figures cleared just over $6.5 million. No delays, no resistance, just compliance. Halcyon Capital didn't issue a statement. They didn't celebrate anything. They simply corrected the mistake. Quietly. Marissa was gone within the week. Officially. She had resigned to pursue other opportunities. Unofficially. She had been the easiest variable to remove. Daniel lasted a little longer, but not much. Leadership shifts don't make headlines when they're designed to look like restructuring, but inside the company, everyone understood what had happened. He wasn't fired. He was repositioned. A title without power, a role without influence, a slow, quiet exit. As for me, I didn't return their calls after that. Not Rachel's follow-up, not the board's attempt to stay connected, not even the external offers that started appearing almost immediately once the story began to circulate in the right circles. I chose carefully. And when I did, it wasn't for a position, it was for leverage. Westridge Advisory didn't offer me a job. They offered me a seat at the table. Strategy division, equity included, decision-making authority written into the contract, not implied, not promised. Written. I signed it the same way I sign everything, after reading every line, a week later. I was sitting by a rooftop pool, the city glowing beneath the evening sky. My phone rested beside me, silent now. No urgency, no tension, just clarity. They thought they had ended my story in that conference room. What they actually did was finalize my exit on my terms, and paid for it in full. That's my story. What about yours? If you've ever faced a moment like this where everything felt stacked against you, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. I used to believe that hard work alone would protect me, that if I delivered results, stayed loyal, and gave more than expected, everything else would fall into place. But this experience taught me something deeper. Value isn't just what you give, it's what you protect. If you don't understand your worth, someone else will define it for you and not in your favor. I didn't win because I was lucky. I won because I paid attention, prepared in silence, and respected myself enough to never rely on assumptions. Sometimes, the strongest move isn't fighting back loudly, it's knowing you've already secured the outcome long before the conflict begins. If this story meant something to you, don't just watch and move on. Be part of a community that learns, grows, and stands stronger together. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.